please introduce my friend and an outstanding debater, Stephen Johnson.
Well, thank you to Dr. Orman and to everyone, all of the programs that have invited me here and all of you for showing up. We're going to start tonight with a quiz, as any good class should. So I have been handing out to some folks a card, simple index card. If you don't have one of those, would you raise your hand? Fantastic. If you don't have an index card, if you need an index card, raise your hand. You bet. And by the way, we have just one screen available, so if you all can't see the screen, you're going to miss out on some stuff. And thanks, David. There's plenty of seats over here on this side of the room, so you might want to, at this point, make a transition over here. It's going to make things a little easier for you for the evening. All right, I promised a quiz. The quiz is based on a story. Well, if I can get that to work, there we go. It's based on a story. The story is pretty simple. There are three people, Jack, Anne, and George, standing near each other. The details that you all know about this group of three are as follows. Jack is looking at Anne is looking at George, and Jack is married, but George is not. Based on that story, I would like you to answer this question. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? I'm going to give you about 30 seconds or so to think about it. Once you have an answer, write it prominently on that card. Simply write A, B, or C. You don't need to write out the whole answer. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? If you believe there is a married person looking at an unmarried person, you'd select A. If you believe there's not a married person looking at an unmarried person, select B. And if you say it cannot be determined, write C on your card. Got about 15 seconds left. A is yes, B is no, C is I can't tell. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? All right, write your answer down. And if you would pass your cards forward, please. You don't have to put your name on it. I don't care who answered what. But pass your cards at the end of the row so I can gather them up. And as you're doing that, there are about 35 or so people in the room, I think. As you're doing that, I would like you to gather in groups of about 5 or 6 people. So turn to the people near you. Make yourselves into a group of about 5 or 6 people. Thank you. Make yourselves into a group of about 5 or 6 people. Great. All right, we have some groups. Everybody feel like they belong somewhere? Fantastic. Now I want your group to come up with a single answer. You got about 5 minutes or so to talk about this.
I thought that too, but if Anne's married, she's looking
Thank you.
Yeah, but Anne's just...
Because it says, is a married person looking at an unmarried person?
Well, if she has to be if she's married, then she's looking at if she's unmarried, she's
Yeah.
But if Anne is unmarried,
You're messing with her mind.
she's unmarried,
Those are meant to mess with your mind. I think so. I know, right?
I mean, the only other hard thing I have to think about is actually Lauren went off. Am I getting up?
There you go. There you go. There you go. Me too. I'm like,
And that could not be determined.
and what am I wearing today? You know, but I reset my alarm by get up. Come on, you gotta with the it's so cold. Yeah, I was like, I could just stay here and stay warm.
Tell me, change the lamp. Because I have I guess you still do But then they forgot to say again.
I know.
All right, if your group is finished, what I would like you to do is take a piece of paper and write down your answer. A is yes, B is no, C is can't be determined. This is just one answer for your group. One answer for your group, please.
Is that Kraber? Oh yeah, the one that Kraber up at the
All right, any groups need more time? Any group not have an answer yet?
What do you say?
I'm glad I command your attention. That's excellent. Does every group have their answer written down? Yeah? Give it to someone you trust. Somebody who's not going to change it to obviate the group's will. Hold on to it. We'll get to it in a minute. I'm going to talk to you tonight about reasoning. And I'm curious to know what you think reasoning is. So when you hear that you're going to come to a talk about reasoning, what do you imagine we're going to talk about tonight? What is reasoning? It is a loaded question. But what does it mean?
I would say one side is right.
To say one side is right. Okay. So
why? Why is that side right?
there we go. Now we're getting closer, right? So already we know that we reason in circumstances of uncertainty, right? We reason when we don't know the answer. When the answer is obvious and known to us, there's no reason to reason. There is only observation. But when we enter into circumstances of uncertainty, that is, we're unsure of what the answer is, and there are a host of reasons why we might be unsure, we're called upon to reason. You went further. You said it's about the
reason why.
It's about the why, right? That word, that question, the why. It's about the why. So tell me about the why. What does why mean? In the context of reasoning, what does reasoning do for the question why?
Well, because you have to have like information that will back up why it's correct. Kind of like, I'm gonna go off of a video I recently seen. 1 times 1 does not equal 1.
Okay.
Because, why? Your multiplication is to multiply, but 1 does not multiply. But why? Why is it 1? Why does it not multiply like everything else in the multiplication table does?
But it has been multiplied by 1.
But it's like, it doesn't, because if you put it in on your phone, it does not.
No.
If you put it in the correct way as a mathological, if you're a math genius, it does not come out to being 1.
My training is not in mathematics, so I'm going to trust you on that. But I will say this, the interesting part of your answer is that you offered an explanation, right? You provided us with a justification for the belief that you hold. In this case, the belief that you cannot multiply something by 1 or something like that. Anyway, the point, no, I don't know, we're not going to get back into it. But the point is you're offering reasons, you're offering an explanation that leads someone else through the progression of ideas that you used to arrive at the conclusion that you hold, right? You said something earlier too, right? The very first thing when I asked the question, you said something, it's about arriving at conclusions, absolutely. So when we reason, we use organizations of ideas, or a particular organization of ideas, to lead us to a particular conclusion. So these are questions that we're facing that are questions, as I mentioned earlier, of uncertainty, questions about what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, what the future holds for us, things to which we literally don't have objective answers. We rely upon reason to find those answers. What I'm going to talk to you tonight are a couple of really important advances that have been made in the last 20 or so years in what we know about human reasoning and how we reason. And it's really important that we understand that, because one of the explanations that we offer about humanity, about why we're unique as a species on this earth, is because we have the capacity to reason. That is, we have the capacity to think about things that perhaps don't yet exist and find relationships between ideas that do exist in ways that benefit us. And so we're able to use this power, this capacity, this ability to examine our own thinking, to align ideas in a particular way, and to ultimately arrive at a conclusion that might otherwise not have been obvious or can't be known absolutely. And this is a critically important skill. It is on the basis of reason that we build all sorts of institutions in our society. And the fundamental belief in humans' capacity for reason, born of the Enlightenment over 200 plus years ago, has established these institutions on which we rely. Things like democracy is built upon a fundamental belief in the human capacity for reason, that if you present people with good arguments and allow them to sort through those arguments, they will ultimately come to the best decision, right? This is an important capacity. So understanding it is going to be important to us. I'm going to tell you about 3 different advances in our understanding of human reasoning. The first is this notion that reasoning is for arguing. To understand that, you first of all have to understand a couple of perspectives on reasoning. The first is what we call the intellectualist perspective on reasoning. This is, for many years, including beginning with the Enlightenment, the perspective that we had on human reasoning. We understood human reasoning to be an individual cognitive skill, that what it allowed us to do was to make decisions better, to look at facts, to look at evidence, to look at relationships between ideas, to examine our principles and understand that which aligns with that evidence, which aligns with those ideas, which is grounded in our principles, and ultimately make a decision amongst options that would be best for us based upon this capacity for reason. The goal of this sort of perspective, the goal of reasoning from the individualist perspective, was that we use reason to find the truth. That individually, we can find truth if we just apply reason to these uncertain questions that we have. Descartes is a famous philosopher that once said, "I think, therefore I am." The underlying principle of what he was saying is that I have the ability to understand the world around me if I think carefully, and I think clearly, and I think objectively about that world. I will eventually get as close to the truth as I possibly can because of my own individual capacity for reasoning. And this is the perspective that kicked off the Enlightenment, that built institutions like democracy and universities and journalism and capitalist economies, right? All of these sorts of things that have been the foundation of our progress over the last 200 years and have led us to live in the civilization we live in today are grounded upon this fundamental belief in human reason, that we can find truth if we just think hard enough about it. But there's a problem with this perspective. Fundamentally, what we're discovering when we study human reasoning from this perspective is that we don't reason particularly well. The first thing we understand is that humans are lazy when it comes to reasoning. That is, we don't reason. When we are challenged with ideas, when we're presented with uncertainty, when we're forced to make a decision, by and large, we don't reason. We don't apply this capacity that we have for engaging in complex abstract thought to the things that are really important to us. Another really important problem that we notice in reasoning is that we are biased when we reason. That is, we don't reason effectively because we can't really sort through well the evidence that is before us. We can't assess facts well, particularly when we're looking for facts that might contradict what we already generally believe. So it's a weird contradiction that we, on the one hand, credit human reasoning with being the foundation of the very civilization in which we live, the penultimate cognitive ability that human beings have, the very thing that distinguishes us as a species, is supposed to be human reasoning. Yet time and again, we see evidence that we don't do it very well. What kind of evidence? Dramatic evidence that we don't reason well. These are 4 very well-known studies on human reasoning that demonstrate that we don't, as an individual, reason well. The Watson selection test was a test that was developed in the 1960s. It's a logic test, very similar to the logic test that I gave you at the beginning of this class. That logic test is designed in such a way where you have 4 cards spread out before you. On the one side is a letter, on the other side is a number. And the general conditional rule that people are asked to follow is if there's a vowel on one side of the card, there's an odd number on the other side of the card. And then the cards are arranged in such a way such that there are sometimes vowels showing, sometimes consonants showing, sometimes numbers showing. And the participants are asked of a particular card, would you have to turn that card over to verify whether or not there is an odd number on the other side? 75% of people fail the Watson selection test. The conjunction fallacy was another psychological study of human reasoning that asked people about circumstances in a narrative. So, for example, they were given a very simple narrative. Mary is a teller at a bank. And people were asked questions like, does Mary know how to do mathematics well? And is Mary a feminist who knows how to do mathematics well? And as you can see, 85% of people made an error in their reasoning by selecting the characterization of Mary that was based upon her gender, not based upon her profession. More people chose that Mary was likely a feminist who did math well than she was just a person who did math well. Confirmation bias is one with which we're all familiar. Confirmation bias demonstrates again and again that we tend to prefer evidence that conforms to our pre-existing beliefs, that when we encounter information anew, if that information contradicts what we believe to be true, we tend to find that information to be unbelievable. Whereas if we find information that conforms with what we already believe, we find that information a great deal more credible. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is very similar in that we assume in spheres where we have no particular expertise, we assume we're a lot smarter than we are. And this happens time and again on the internet, right? Pick any issue that arises, whether it's the efficacy of vaccines or foreign policy and the benefits of the US international aid. People weigh in on opinions with strongly held arguments that ultimately prove that they don't know much about what they're talking about, despite the fact that they believe they do. In this case, 65% of people overestimated their own knowledge and ability to comment on a factual question because of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the curious question is why, if we believe that human reasoning is such a valuable and powerful skill, why is it that we're so bad at it? This is a question that consumed a couple of researchers around 2010, 2011. Their names were Mercier and Sperber. And they came up with a perspective that said, in fact, reasoning should not be understood as an individual skill. This perspective that we had on reasoning, the intellectualist perspective, was not leading us to good conclusions that helped us understand how reasoning works. Instead, they proposed that reasoning should be thought of from an interactionist perspective. Their point of view was that reasoning is not a cognitive skill that we have, but in fact, reasoning is a social phenomenon. that we don't reason until we get into groups. You can start to see why I asked you the questions I asked you at the beginning, right? The quiz that I had you take. The goal of reasoning, according to Mercier and Sperber, is not to help us make better decisions and ultimately to find the truth, but rather to manage our social interactions in order that we can facilitate a coordination of effort. Now, that demands some explanation. And in order to explain it, I have to tell you a little bit about evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is a perspective that applies the principles of evolution to our understanding of how we think. So evolutionary psychology says the way that you behave in the world, the way that you think about the world, the way that you communicate about the world is all grounded in certain evolutionary priorities that were served when you developed that ability. Not you individually, of course, but you as a member of the human species do the things you do because of evolutionary pressures that were applied throughout the entirety of our history that led you to develop certain skills and perspectives, right? So of course, one of the things that is absolutely true about humans that differentiates us in terms of complexity of the type of thing that we do is that we tend to coordinate effort. We do a lot of things together, whether that's agriculture or defending ourselves or building civilizations or managing economies or designing systems of government. The things that we do that make our lives more productive and comfortable and safe and healthy are usually the product not of one individual's efforts, but rather the product of all of us working together in order to make those things happen. Well, all of that is great, but in order for that level of coordination to occur, there has to be a lot of communication that happens between people, right? I have to be able to express to you what my desires are, what I would like you to do to contribute to those desires, to convince you that those desires are worth pursuing, that they're a good idea, that they'll benefit us all. And then once I've convinced you of that, I have to keep you on track, working towards some goal collectively and ultimately rewarding you for participating in that process. This level of communication reveals a couple of things about what might motivate the development of reasoning skill. Stick with me. If people can communicate, look at it this way. When people first learned to communicate, I would venture to say that one of the earliest things that they learned to do after they were able to form complex communication interactions with one another is they began lying to each other. Now, that's a pretty dire view of humanity, but let's be honest. There are lots of reasons why we engage in deception. We engage in deception to serve our own interests, to manage our own identities, to get other people to do the things that we want them to do that might be against their own interests. We routinely engage in deception with one another. Mercier and Sperber said this tendency toward deception motivated us to develop something they called epistemic vigilance. So epistemic, or to talk about the episteme, or to talk about the epistemic, means you're talking about your perspective on the world, what you know about the world, what you understand about the world, your worldview, your understanding of how things work. Epistemology is everything that you know about the world. Epistemic vigilance, according to Mercier and Sperber, means that we have an evolutionary inclination to protect ourselves from other people deceiving us. We know that if we're deceived too often, things can go wrong, right? We can be tricked out of our resources, we can be put into dangerous situations, we can be led to do things that are against our interests. And so they say we have to develop some means by which we protect ourselves. Epistemic vigilance is that skepticism that we have of things that other people tell us. So we are naturally programmed from an evolutionary perspective to be skeptical of the things that other people say to us. We don't tend to believe them. Well, if you look at this in evolutionary terms, what effectively that means is that the people who were dumb, who were easily fooled and lied to, died. They didn't get to pass along their genes. But those people with a natural inclination towards skepticism lived and were able to develop progeny, who eventually developed more progeny, who eventually made this a characteristic that the vast majority of us now share. This epistemic vigilance was good for us because it protected us from being deceived. But simultaneously, it also made coordination difficult. Because now, if someone says to you, hey, I've got a good idea, you don't automatically believe them. Instead, your epistemic vigilance inclines you to reject that idea. And consequently, nature has to come up with some way to get around that, right? To allow you to prove to someone else that your idea that you have is in fact good, to overcome their epistemic vigilance. We use reason to do that. The evolutionary perspective on human reasoning says that reasoning is not an individual cognitive skill that you have. Instead, reasoning is a skill that is built for arguing. That what we do with reasoning is not assess information objectively to make good decisions, but rather we use reasoning to generate really strong arguments. And we do so for two reasons. The first reason is because we use reasoning to justify things. The vast majority of our decision making, by the way, and this is all very interesting, recent research has come out as well. Daniel Kahneman wrote some really interesting stuff called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. You might have heard of this book. It was very popular a few years ago. The essential thesis of the book is that we make decisions from down here, and then we rationalize those decisions up here. In other words, we make decisions from instinct, and only once we've made a decision do we go back and fill in the blanks to justify that decision to ourselves. So we use reason in part to offer some justification for the instinctive decision making that we naturally arrive at. The other reason that we use reasoning as a social phenomenon is to justify those decisions to others, to argue, convincing others that our perspective is right. That what we do with reasoning is generate good substantiation for the positions, opinions, perspectives, and goals that we have, and then invite others to join us in that reasoning. We try and convince them that the conclusions that we've arrived at are conclusions that they should arrive at by outlining the same path of logic and the same evidence that we have used to arrive at that condition. The beautiful thing about this explanation is that those bugs of argumentation that we talked about earlier, that human beings are lazy and biased when it comes to reasoning, if you take the interactionist perspective on reasoning, those bugs actually become features. The reason that we're lazy, the reason that we don't engage in the reasoning process when making an individual decision is because thinking is expensive. And I don't mean expensive in terms of money, but it's expensive in terms of our biological energy. It takes a lot of effort to think. It's hard to do. And quite literally, it consumes a lot of calories. So if you're concerned about your survival as an organism on the savannah, the last thing that you want to do is spend a lot of time uselessly expending energy on a cognitive process if you don't have to. This is why we make decisions from instinct, because it's quick, it's effortless, it's low cost, and it doesn't require a great deal of us. So if you are asked to make a decision, generally you're going to default to that instinct, and if it's just you that's affected, you're not going to engage that reasoning process because the law of conservation, which is a fundamental principle of evolution, the law of conservation says you don't expend energy unnecessarily. That bug becomes a feature. Similarly, the notion that humans are biased is a bug when thought of from the intellectualist perspective, because it says reasoning doesn't function well because we have things like cognitive bias, right? We have things like the confirmation bias, where we prefer evidence that affirms our own beliefs. Well, that's a bug of reasoning if you look at it from the intellectualist perspective. But if you look at it from the interactionist perspective, it makes a lot more sense. Because if the purpose of reasoning is to convince others of your good ideas, then you're going to want to prefer evidence that confirms those arguments for you. You're going to want to select evidence, and prefer reasoning that makes your argument stronger. So you're tuned to find evidence that confirms your ideas, because ultimately that makes your ideas stronger and more persuasive so that you can convince others to join you in that coordination effort to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish. I find this fascinating as a perspective on human reasoning, because ultimately what we see again and again is that in order for us to reason well as human beings, we can't do so individually. We have to gather together to reason. We have to exchange arguments in the process of reasoning. And we have to collectively evaluate those arguments Because only in those circumstances will we trigger the reasoning process and cause people to actually think about things from a reasonable perspective. That means that we have to build venues where we can reason together. We have to carefully protect and tend those venues. We have to develop those venues and preserve them in ways that will guarantee that we preserve this critically important aspect of human civilization. Because without this, things tend to collapse, and I'm going to get to that in just a second too. But back to our story. Remember our story? Jack, Ann, and George are standing around. We know that Jack is looking at Ann. We know that Ann is looking at George. We know that Jack is married and that George is not. And the question that I posed to you is a married person looking at an unmarried person. And I gave you 3 options: yes, no, or cannot be determined. As individuals, you did pretty poorly. 65% of those who responded said this cannot be determined from the information that was provided. 31% said yes, and 1 person, 0.02%, said no. Well, what is the right answer to the question? The answer is yes. And the logic, if you're looking for the logic, we know that Jack is looking at Ann is looking at George, Jack is married, George is not. That leaves us with the uncertain question of what is Ann's marital status? She's either married or unmarried, right? If she's unmarried, then a married person, Jack, is looking at an unmarried person, Ann. If, on the other hand, she is married, then we know that she, Ann, is looking at George, and therefore a married person is looking at an unmarried person. So now the question for my groups, and here's why I said give it to somebody you trust. How many groups answered A, yes? Look around. Just about every group got it. Despite the fact that two-thirds of individuals answering that question got it wrong, nearly every group got it right. What this tells you is you're not reasoning until you're with other people. Your sense of reasoning doesn't trigger, doesn't happen, doesn't activate until you get into discussions with people. This helps explain why debate is so important, right? This helps explain why venues in which we debate and the means by which we debate and training in oral argumentation, exchanging ideas with one another is so critically important. Which group didn't get it right? What was your answer?
It was C because we all wrote C down originally and then said, oh, like all of our answers back. And we didn't talk about it.
Anybody want to take a shot at an explanation? Hey, wait, this is actually a really good test. Anybody want to take a shot at an explanation of what happened to this group from an evolutionary perspective? I'll give you the chance first.
I was going to say, we did change our answer, like when you flipped it back, we did figure out that it was A. And so we're like, well, we already said C.
I appreciate your honesty, and I'm going to give you credit for it, despite the fact that that credit means nothing. I'm going to give you credit for it. But I'm still curious about that. Why did this group not arrive at the answer when almost every other group did?
Because they didn't debate it.
Why didn't they debate it?
Because they just looked at it and figured, oh, well, because Anne, it doesn't say that Anne is married or not, so they just automatically thought.
They already had a group consensus.
There it is. Yeah, right? The first thing they said is we all came into this saying C. We all came into this believing that there wasn't sufficient information for us to determine the truth or falsity of that question. And because there was no opposition, there was no debate. Because there was no debate, there was no reasoning. Because there was no reasoning, there was not the right answer, right? This is what it means to say reasoning is a social phenomenon. In order for us to reason, we have to gather in groups. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that individuals can't reason. Certainly you can. You can do so individually. You can do so by yourself. But to develop the capacity to reason well requires that you spend time with others learning how to do it. There's another theorist named Deanna Kuhn who teaches at the University of Columbia University. And she studies how young people learn to reason. And of course, as you would expect, given this subject of the conversation, almost all of her work is designed to is focused on designing opportunities for young people to argue with one another. And she describes this as the missing interlocutor problem. An interlocutor is someone with whom you have a discussion. She says that young people have a missing interlocutor. That is, in their heads, they don't have anybody that they argue with. And what they need to do is to develop that internal interlocutor, that sense of self that says no when part of you wants to say yes, that says wrong when part of you wants to say right. Because without that sort of internal voice, that internal voice of dissent, you're never going to reason well as an individual. We develop that only when we engage in these arguments or opportunities to reason together with one another. And absent that, we get groups that don't debate and therefore don't reason, and therefore individuals that don't debate with themselves and therefore don't reason well. Make sense? Okay, that's the first of 3 things I want to tell you about what evolution tells us about human reasoning. The second is that reasoning is spatial. When we're talking about reasoning, by and large, we're talking about abstract reasoning. And by abstract reasoning, I mean that we are looking for relationships between ideas and determining the proper order of those ideas such that they lead us through a path of logic to arrive at a particular conclusion. Abstract reasoning is incredibly complex because you're not only talking about things that are intangible, like relationships and orders of things, right? The order in which things occur. You're also tending to deal with abstractions themselves, things like right and wrong, just and unjust, desirable and undesirable. These are not things that have analogs in the real world. When I talk about a piece of paper, I can hold up a piece of paper. And while the notion of paper is an abstraction, this piece of paper is real. That abstraction is tied to a very clear phenomenon. Somebody point to justice for me. In this classroom right now, point to justice. Where is beauty? Okay, yeah, lots of people pointing to themselves. That was a gimme. I should have thought through that one. Where do you find truth in this classroom? If you had to walk over and pick truth up, where would you look? Right, these are silly questions, right? Because those things don't have physical analogs. They don't exist. So we're talking about not only things that don't exist in the real world in the way that we think about things having corporeal presence in the real world, we're talking about the relationship between those abstractions, right? What is good and what leads us to good and how do we better achieve good and what would good be in these circumstances choosing? I mean, those are incredibly complex things to sort out. Abstract reasoning is not an easy thing to do. It is implausible that we would spontaneously develop abstract reasoning. If you think about it in evolutionary terms, when we were either crawling out of the slime or running across the savannah, worried about our own survival, it is implausible that suddenly that one creature who was running either away from a predator that was chasing it or toward a food source that they were trying to capture, it is implausible that they would stop and go, is this the right thing to do? Right? It just doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary perspective that we develop this extraordinarily complex process, and that one that is, to reference an earlier idea I introduced, one that is so incredibly expensive in terms of the energy expended in order to accomplish it. So the question then becomes, where did reasoning, abstract reasoning, come from? The answer is it came from spatial reasoning. This was noted by people who study metaphors. And metaphors are interesting phenomena. Linguistic metaphors particularly are interesting phenomena. If you understand what a metaphor is, of course, it's that literary device that we use to compare things without making direct comparisons. And what we've noticed, particularly people who study metaphors, not because they're beautiful or stimulating or illustrative, but people who study metaphors because they believe that they reveal how we think, started to recognize something peculiar about metaphors. Daniel Casasanto is one of those people who said that many linguists note that when people talk about states, possession, ideas, and desires, they do so by co-opting the language of intuitive physics. In particular, words borrowed from physical domains of space, force, and motion give rise to linguistic metaphors for countless abstract ideas. right? A pretty complex way of saying that a lot of the metaphors we use to describe the world around us are grounded in our understanding of the physical space of the world around us. Think of some of these metaphors that are very common to us, that we use to explain things, like high prices, big events, long times and close connections, distant cousins, pushing the limits, forcing the issue, going easy on people, problems are hard, and we strain credibility, right? All of these metaphors that we use to talk about these things are grounded in our notion of how the world works and where we are in it. They all have something to do with the relationship to how we exist in the world. That's true not only generally about the metaphors we use to talk about the world around us, that's particularly true when we talk about how people argue. When people argue, they do things like taking positions, right? A position is a place that you are. But when we talk about arguing, we talk about taking a position, right? Does that mean you have to stand in a particular place to have an opinion? No, that's not at all what we mean. But there's something there in that relationship that causes us to think about being in a place, arguing from standpoints, framing controversies, seeking acceptable grounds of argument, or defining the boundaries of conflicts, all have to do with our notion of space. But similarly, we use notions of force or metaphors of force to move audiences, advance positions, backpedal from stances that we take, engage in strategic maneuvering and following lines of logic. These all have to do with where we're going and how we get there, the force with which we move things, right? Well, what does this have to do with where reasoning came from? Steven Pinker is a noted cognitive psychologist who studies how we think. He's written a number of terrific books. I recommend just about anything that he's written. But this line that he wrote in '99 really captured my attention. He said, models of space and force don't act like figures of speech intended to convey new insights. In other words, they're not mere metaphors that convey relationships between ideas. Rather, he said, they seem closer to the medium of thought itself, which is a pretty profound statement. What Pinker is saying here is not that these metaphors are just convenient for us, that they help us explain things that we might not otherwise have a frame of reference for. But rather, he says, you can see thinking happening in these metaphors. To explain this requires that we go back again to evolutionary psychology and understand some of the forces that might have produced our ability to reason about abstractions. So, it's relatively straightforward to say that the very first kind of reasoning that we developed as creatures from an evolutionary perspective is spatial reasoning. Because spatial reasoning has a very direct connection to our ability to survive, right? If you know where the food is, where the threats are, and where the potential sexual partners are, you are pretty likely to be able to survive as an organism, right? If you don't know those things, if you can't reason spatially, you're going to have a very hard time surviving. If you're always uncertain about where the food is or how to get there, if you don't know where the threats are coming from or how to get away, if you don't know where potential sexual partners are located or how to find them, you're not going to be successful in passing along your genetic lineage, and therefore your contributions to the species are going to be ended. On the other hand, if you're good at those things, you can find the food, avoid the threats, and locate your sexual partners, chances are pretty good that your genetic lineage is going to get spread. So it makes sense that creatures that have good spatial reasoning would survive and be the evolutionary foundation for later generations of those species. But it doesn't necessarily explain how we get to abstract reasoning. To understand that, we have to go to another theorist named Stephen Gould. Stephen Gould was an evolutionary biologist, and he was one of the first people that introduced the idea of exaptation. So adaptation is a relatively straightforward concept in evolution. Adaptation says that we face a challenge as an organism, and those organisms that have a mutation that allows them to better meet that challenge are more likely to survive. That survival then passes that genetic lineage along, and the next generation is even better able to adapt, and more creatures are better able to face that problem. That's adaptation. Stephen Gould introduced the idea of exaptation. He said sometimes what happens is not that we confront an obstacle and the right mutation happens that addresses that obstacle and allows us to survive as a species. He says sometimes we adapt a certain characteristic to meet an obstacle, a challenge, and allow us to survive. But sometimes that characteristic gets cross-applied to an entirely different phenomenon. And the famous example that Stephen Gould came up with was dinosaurs and feathers. His research suggests that the birds that we know now evolved from dinosaurs, a relatively well-accepted hypothesis at this point. But he said it doesn't make any sense that suddenly a creature would sprout feathers and be able to fly. Instead, he said what likely happened was that reptiles developed cooling systems. Remember, reptiles are cold-blooded, and so they need some system by which they can cool themselves effectively because they don't regulate temperature in the same way that mammals do. So he said what likely happened was they began to develop things that looked like feathers and eventually feathers that allowed them to better regulate their body temperature. And that was great because that adaptation to changing climate allowed them to pass along their genetic lineage. But there was one day, perhaps, when one of those nice and cool feathered reptiles was being chased by a predator and happened to run off a cliff. And because that creature had those feathers, which again, from evolutionary perspective, was designed not to fly but to cool, because they had those feathers, they were able to glide to the ground and not die. That means they were able to pass along their genetic heritage. And then more and more feathered reptiles were chased off cliffs, and they too were able to pass along their genetic heritage. Feathers were never designed to fly. Feathers were designed by evolution to meet the challenge of cooling a body. But they were exapted, that is, taken from their original purpose and cross-applied to an entirely different purpose that also just happened to be evolutionarily advantageous. This largely is the same thing that likely happened with our ability to reason abstractly. That what we ended up doing was developing strong spatial reasoning skills. And then eventually, at some point, we came to be able to apply all of those spatial reasoning skills that we had to abstract problems, to things that didn't exist, and directions that don't have any correlation to the physical world around us. But yet we still think about lines of logic and following people to conclusions and arriving at those conclusions based upon foundations of good evidence, right? And the very things that we use to describe what happens in argumentation and what happens in reasoning are grounded in that very notion of spatiality. The logic that we use today is heavily imbued with spatiality. Think of the simple outline. An outline, I keep trying to go to that screen, an outline demonstrates the logical relationship between ideas. By virtue of where you place information relative to other information, literally spatially on the page, you can tell the logical relationship between that information. We know that large and far left placement communicates the superiority of an idea. It's above other ideas, it's to the left of those ideas. If I indent and put an idea below it, we're communicating the subordinality of that idea, that that idea is subordinate to the idea above it. If those ideas are similarly placed in the same margination as other ideas, then those ideas coordinate with other ideas. That simple outline reveals a great deal about how our logic works in terms of the spatial reasoning from which it was adapted. Similarly, if you've ever taken an argumentation class, you've encountered the Toulmin model of argumentation. That model of argumentation also communicates a great deal of spatiality in how it's arranged. Note there that there are lines that connect the ideas, moving from ground to claim. There are things that influence that process as it moves along. And those relations, there are relations between those things too that are communicated in the model that is developed that depends upon that very notion of spatiality. Venn diagrams also communicate this notion of spatiality. Set logic says that the characteristics of group A are different from the characteristics of group B, except where those things overlap. So they share that property between group A and group B in that space where they overlap. That notion of set logic of differentiation is grounded upon our understanding of spatial relationships. Similarly, the property of transitivity, one of the most basic properties of formal logic, says that if you arrange things from left to right, A to B to C, then we know that if B is to the left of C, then A must also be to the left of C. That simple arrangement communicates the logic that is embedded in that relationship by virtue of its spatiality. What does this tell us about how we reason and why we reason? It tells us that, first of all, in order to make ideas make sense, we have to align them properly. We have to put them in a particular order. And the purpose of putting that order is so that others can follow. There again, you can't even talk about it without using metaphors. So that others can follow our path of logic to arrive at the conclusion that we have arrived at. Understanding that spatiality goes a long way towards informing how we teach argumentation, how we understand argumentation, logic, and reasoning, and importantly, how we improve our ability to engage in that process. So I've told you two things so far about, I should tell you this too. And this isn't just me making this up, by the way. There are now people who are studying through magnetic imaging of brain function and discovering that in fact, that spatiality that we imagine when we talk about relationships between ideas has a direct and literal connection to where things occur in our brain. So this is a study that was published in Science magazine, reported on Science magazine, it was published in a journal. But effectively it says that if you engage in an imaging of a person while they're thinking, you can actually see the relationship between the ideas they're thinking about on that magnetic resonance imaging that's occurring. And the very same mechanisms, the very same brain functions that we use to navigate our physical world are the same brain functions that we use to navigate our abstract world. That is, that when we put a problem before someone and say, get from point A to point B, and we map what their brain does when they figure that physical problem out, we can give them an abstract problem and they'll use those same mechanisms to maneuver through, between, and find relationships among the ideas that they are manipulating in that reasoning process. I find this fascinating because it tells us a great deal about how we can effectively teach people to reason and what we have to teach them in order to get them to reason well. Okay, third and final thing I want to tell you about the relationship between reasoning and evolutionary psychology is to tell you that reasoning is hedonic. To say that means to say that reasoning feels really good to us. And this notion of hedonism, this notion that we enjoy reasoning, that there's almost a prurient interest that we have in reasoning, is explained by evolutionary psychology. Think of it this way. Sex is a critically important evolutionary phenomenon. It's the means by which we pass our genetic lineage along to others. But in evolutionary terms, sex doesn't make sense by itself because the rewards of engaging in sex are delayed. That is, you got 9 months from an evolutionary perspective between the time that you have sex and the time that there is a reward for the broader species for the fact that you had sex, right? That's when the baby is born. Now, there's an evolutionary advantage to having the baby be born, obviously. That's the means by which the species perpetuates itself. But there can be no relationship between the act of sex and that reward because nobody, well, very few people, have sex thinking, boy, I can't wait for 9 months because that's when this is really gonna pay off, right? I gotta go through this now because I know in 9 months I'm gonna get rewarded for this. I'm gonna have a child and that's an important thing. What evolution did for us is develop a hedonistic motivation for sex. We don't have sex generally. We don't have sex because we know in 9 months there's going to be a baby produced. We have sex because in the moment it feels damn good, right? The orgasm is a terrific example of an evolutionary adaptation that motivates us to do certain things that we otherwise probably wouldn't do because we don't see the immediacy of the reward. The same is true for reasoning. by and large, particularly if you're talking about Mercier and Sperber's perspective on human reasoning, the benefits of reasoning don't accrue for quite some time. The benefits of reasoning are coordination. In other words, because we reason, we're able to communicate with each other and coordinate our behavior to produce desirable outcomes. That's things like agriculture and husbandry and security, right? That's building walls around your village, or training people to defend your village, or raising crops, or tending animals. All of those things are critically important, but they don't necessarily accrue immediate advantages. The same is largely true of reasoning, right? That we reason in order to coordinate our activity to produce those desirable outcomes, but the desirable outcomes don't happen for a long, long time. So what that means for us is that nature had to find some way to reward us in the moment for reasoning. It couldn't just be that we had to trust that eventually there would be an outcome from our coordination. It had to be something that made us enjoy it in the moment. And this is what Mercier and Sperber, the same folks that came up with this notion that reasoning is for arguing, this is what Mercier and Sperber said, that we reason in part because it feels really good to reason. And here I'd reference my own experience learning to reason. I grew up in, as Trish mentioned, South Dakota. Graduated with a very small country town in South Dakota. It's called Rossall, South Dakota. It's far in the northeast corner of South Dakota. I grew up in this small town. I graduated with a class of 10 people. I'd never heard of debate in my life. And I went to college not because I was intellectually curious, because I really enjoyed partying. And my cousin had gone to college, and I used to party with him, and he seemed like he was having a good time, so I thought I would join him. And I did have a really good time my very first year. Such a good time that they almost invited me not to return. Fortunately, I came back for my second year and happened to fall backwards into the activity of academic debating. And I will never forget the moment after my very first debate. I thought to myself, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And I'm still here. I'm still doing it. It's been over 40 years now since that experience, and I'm still doing it. And as I reflect upon that, as I've thought about that over those 40 years, I understand now the reason why I chose to stick with this for 40 years. I stuck with this because it felt really good to argue. I mean, I grew up in a small Lutheran town. I'm a Scandinavian. They don't argue. Lutherans generally are agreeable people. I was the middle child. Those middle children know that you are the mediators. You don't argue with people. Largely raised by a single mom. There were all sorts of forces that told me never to disagree with people, never to argue with people, always to calm the waters and find the middle ground, right? And suddenly in debate, I had the ability to disagree with someone without risking much of anything. And it felt great. The ability for clear thinking, my ability to articulate beliefs, the ability to research something and find a justification for something that somebody else hadn't found, and to be rewarded for that in terms of a win in the competitive debate round, all of that felt really good. What I didn't understand until I encountered this notion from Mercier and Sperber was that the reason it felt good was because of that hedonistic element of reasoning. And this informs us of some important things about how we reason in public right now. Like sex, reasoning can produce good or bad, right? Sex can be a wonderful, beautiful, rewarding, intimate, terrific thing to share with another person. But we also know that there's a dark side to that, right? We also know that things like sexual assault and all sorts of traumatic and ugly things that can happen around sexuality, and whether an individual is treated with respect or not, all of these things can either color that experience to produce a really good outcome or color that experience to produce a really bad outcome. Right now, in the public sphere of reasoning, we tend to be gravitating toward the more base and ugly instincts of that hedonism. We tend to engage in the process of arguing with one another in such a way that we don't produce good outcomes for ourselves or for others or for all of us collectively. My point is, because we understand that reasoning can feel good and can produce good outcomes, we need to instead start focusing more on concentrating our efforts to produce those moments of beauty and satisfaction and genuine intimacy and understanding between ourselves and others. There's a great book that was written by Agnes Collard called Open Socrates, The Case for a Philosophic Life. And she's a bit goofy, but I love what she writes. She says she's been married twice now, which might in some ways kind of contradict her thesis. But she says the best marriages are those that allow individuals to disagree regularly with one another, that are grounded upon intellectual disagreement, what she calls philosophic dissatisfaction. That philosophical dissatisfaction is that you are never satisfied with the other person's answer. You're always challenging them and expecting them to challenge you. And in that interaction and cooperation, both of you produce better perspectives. Both of you produce a better outlook on the world, and ideally greater respect for one another. The point I would leave you with tonight is this: understanding what we have talked about so far about evolutionary psychology and the various insights that it offers to us about human reasoning, I would challenge you to leave this conversation with a commitment to doing better, to engaging others with a degree of respect and with a degree of esteem that ensures that we orient that hedonistic element of reasoning in such a way that not only feels good, but produces good. Because you can make that choice individually and for yourself, how you engage in that process of arguing with other people. And my fundamental belief is we're a long ways from it right now, and until we start to make explicit and concerted effort to improve the means by which we reason together and collectively, we're in trouble if we don't, right? Until we start to make that effort, we risk turning away from that fundamental belief that we have in the human capacity to reason and improve our circumstances, and instead start to put our trust in authoritarians or superstition as the source of our truth. And that's a very dangerous place to be. Ultimately, history teaches us that societies built upon a single source of truth, whether that is one person in charge of political leadership or one person claiming to speak for some deity that knows the truth and reveals it to us, history teaches us that neither of those scenarios end well for the civilizations that embrace them. We are perilously close now to retreating back to that sort of perspective, what we used to call the Dark Ages, right? That the Enlightenment ended for us. My challenge to you is to engage this hedonistic process of reasoning such that it feels good and produces good for us. To not do so is to risk our very civilization. Thank you all so much for your attention here tonight. Happy to answer any questions or offer any opportunities for insights that you've had, experiences that you might like to bring to bear on the conversation. Yeah, please.
So when we were doing an experiment, and when I was asked the question, I instinctively try to figure it out, and then I was like, oh no, this is too much.
Okay.
So I just put down 8.
Yeah, you're lazy.
When we
Like
got,
everybody else, by the way.
When we got into the group, I'm not saying I was right and they were wrong, because I was wrong. I didn't try to figure it out. I just guessed. I
Sure.
was like, A. My name's A. That's how it works. But then when I got into the group, I didn't want to push the A at all because the whole group had already, most of the group, right? I was like, nope, it's B, except for what's the name? Jen said C. But we were like, yeah, and we tried to reason it, but it really wasn't like, I drew a little diagram and I was like, yeah, totally, this works out. We can justify the B because I wrote this down. So what would you say, was the breakdown in reasoning in that scenario?
Well, I mean, from an interactionist perspective, what happened was your group placed too much concern on the social relationships, the social dynamics of that interaction, and too little concern on the pursuit of truth, right? You were more concerned about what others thought of you than of getting the right answer, right? And so that's not uncommon. That's not a failure. That's what we do, right? We manage our social interactions. If you go around being an asshole, you're not going to last very long, right? So we're careful in how we interact with other people. That just happened here as well. One of the easiest things you can do to combat that, simple, well-known, appoint a devil's advocate. Give someone permission to be oppositional. Literally excuse them from the social repercussions of disagreeing. Say your job, not just it's okay, but your job is to tell me I'm wrong. And that gives that person permission to do so without risking the social consequences of saying you're wrong. Understand?
Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions, observations, insights? I know I've kept you here longer than you expected to be. Go ahead.
So through the whole thing, I was like, I don't know if it's just my brain, the way it's wired, but I was comparing it with nature versus nurture. And in what way can you tie it in with nature versus nurture?
Great
Because
question.
I don't know if I was the only one thinking that, but.
No, it's a fundamental, you're asking the right question.
Okay.
You're absolutely asking the right question. Well, you're on the right path. You're having a bit of a detour. Because the right question is never nature versus nurture. It's how do nature and nurture interact best, right? So what I'm telling you here is some of the nature stuff. And what I do with this as an educator is I design educational processes that capitalize upon the nature way that we ordinarily and by programming think, so that we can better, by nurture, develop those skills. This is Deanna Kuhn stuff. This is the missing interlocutor. You don't have that person, especially when you're a young person, you don't have that voice in your head that's disagreeing with you. You need to develop that. And her whole point is the way, she's written countless papers and books on this question. Her whole point is the way that you develop that is you design opportunities for young people to argue with each other. And the more they argue with each other, you don't even have to teach them how to reason. It is literally just by doing it that you develop that internal interlocutor, that person that naturally disagrees with you in your head. And then you are better able to reason, because as soon as you propose an idea, that person says no, and you've got to justify it. And you got to think it through. And that reasoning process is triggered, and you produce better decisions because of it. It's nature and nurture, not nature versus nurture. You bet. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
I have so many things in here. The biggest one is you said with the birds and the dinosaurs and the evolution
Exaptation.
acceptation.
Not adaptation, but exaptation.
So that principle is kind of floating in my head with passing on genes
Mhm.
and we're evolving. Have we truly went backwards, where those processed genes of arguing, reasoning, and survival have been dropped off, even though we're still evolving? Because it seems that the world is not where it used to be, and those genes have not been passed on. And I feel like
We're getting
maybe
dumber.
right, but in the serious of this world we're in, it is baffling to see how many lazy
And
versus
biased.
biased and not able to come at any other angle with on both sides.
Yeah.
Like this is very heavy stuff, but brings up a very good point of
Yeah, I'm very worried about the state of humanity, and I'm not saying that tongue in cheek. I'm very worried.
asking in the real world, like, is this
Yeah.
educational track that we've been on, are those genes missing?
I would say there are two phenomenon that are contributing to this right now. One is, and this is somewhat controversial because the consequences of this observation are not particularly pleasant, but it is seeming to me undeniable that we have created circumstances where evolution is not guiding our progress anymore. And what I mean by that is that those characteristics and features that would, in ordinary circumstances where survival was a priority, would lead some to be left behind and not pass along their genetic lineage. We have designed systems and circumstances such that those consequences never befall. Now, the ugly part is, oh, so you'd prefer to let people die. Yeah, right, that's a consequence. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying we get back to only the strong survive, or we organize our society such that only the strong survive. But I am saying it is a reality that we have largely removed ourselves from the consequences of being maladapted to survive in the real world. We're about to find out what that looks like, because the second thing that's happening is that people have figured out that both there is a deficit of survival threats and there are natural human failings that they can exploit for their own advantage. And so things like Oh God, there are so many examples, right? The most obvious one is deliberate mis- and disinformation campaigns. Understanding that people by themselves generally are lazy and biased and won't encounter information unless they're given the opportunity to challenge each other. Which means effectively that if you overwhelm people with information, they will largely just take whatever confirms, or they will look for other sources of confirmation. By other sources of confirmation, I mean they don't employ a rational process of evaluating arguments. Instead, they employ loyalty and allegiance as a test for what information they should believe. And so effectively they say, if the person that I want to be like, or that I hope likes me, believes that stuff, I'm going to believe that stuff. And the most important thing is not that I get it right, but that I demonstrate my loyalty. This is tribalism, right? This is the really ugly stuff that's happening in our political process right now. And there are people who are deliberately exploiting that to their own advantage. There are people who are profiting from it, which means that they are indirectly exploiting that. Things like algorithmic content services, right, that attract your attention and keep your eyeballs glued to a screen by confirming the information that you feel like you want confirmed. They are designing processes that keep contrary information from you, right? We call that siloing of information, or that bubble that you exist in, right? Thought bubbles or opinion bubbles that you exist in. They're designing those systems not because they want people to fail, but because they want money. And the natural offshoot of that pursuit of profit is that you no longer organically encounter contrary information. And you are simultaneously overwhelmed with confirming information. And you are so adrift in that sea of information that you reach out for something you can grab, which is loyalty to an ideology or to a person. And damned if that isn't dangerous. And that's where we are. Yeah, David.
So obviously the forum that we have for debate today is social media. And I'm amazing on Facebook, by the way.
Piano and Facebook, you got it all.
What's missing? Why can't we get to all of this in social media?
We can, but we can't with the way social media currently operates. If I had carte blanche, if I was king of the world, the first thing I would do is ban algorithmic content selection. And I would force people to encounter randomly and without predetermination information from a host of different perspectives routinely. Because that is what triggers that process. That's what triggers curiosity and begins those conversations with others, right? And it simultaneously tamps down that notion of partisan loyalty or tribalism. Because no longer is that information coming from your side, it's just coming, it's just there, it just happened, right? That's the way things were before social media, right? You'd bump around in the world and you'd find a left-leaning newspaper or a right-leaning newspaper, you'd talk to your neighbor next door, you'd phone somebody up, you'd talk to a friend you hadn't seen in many years, you'd interact with your classmates and your professors. All of that was organic, right? Now it's all curated. Now, the vast majority of information that we take in is an extraordinarily narrow channel, and it's all the same. So,
is there anything you see within the current structure, for those of us that are right, to better that? I mean,
yeah, I think that a lot more people are interested in talking very explicitly about pluralism and about free expression. Increasingly, there is an appetite for making those discussions and emphases explicit, which means
mean that when Facebook got rid of the fact checking, is that better?
no, God, no.
I'm just curious.
No, not at all. That's
Let's
a
throw that
terrible
content
thing.
out there.
Yeah. No, what I'm talking about is, I mean, the discipline in which I work is pedagogical debating, right? And so what I'm seeing is increasing numbers of people saying, wait a minute, education is failing at its most debate. We can't do the content-based education. We can't teach people biology in terms of what the content of biology is, because we haven't taught them the processes to intake that information. That used to be gained organically, largely organically, or through some osmotic process whereby encountering the substance you would eventually learn how to argue, right? And generally that worked well when the forces of evil weren't pressing on us from every direction and constantly. But now when we've got all of these extraordinarily powerful forces shaping our ability to intake and process information, we need to talk explicitly about this. We need to go back to fundamental education, like how do I teach you how to argue? What does a good venue for argumentation look like? What does good argumentation look like? And we need to do a lot more teaching of that explicitly, because if we're not building the foundations of information processing and analysis, then all the content in the world is going to be useless. Because we're only going to select the stuff, or it's going to be selected for us, that we prefer to see.
I remember finding 5 sources for a
Yes.
paper. You know, I don't know where that fell off.
Did you go to the library to do it?
Yes.
Yeah, you guys. So libraries, for those of you who are under 25, libraries are these buildings that have books in them. I'm kidding. Actually, this person's been.
Under 25, because some of us were like born like right as everything started to fall off.
True. You've been really patient, please.
Let's say you're having
I'm gonna walk back here and grab a water bottle. I'm not coming at you. Thank you.
So let's say that you're having a debate with someone who is really stuck in that bubble.
Yeah.
Passionate?
Yeah, basically. And you give them, they're just only listening to misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah.
But you give them resources like at Fuentes, and you show them all of the true non-biased sources, but they are just stuck in their ways of thinking, and
Yeah.
they don't want to accept the science behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something that you could do to try to kind of help
Absolutely.
that, or other than leading by example?
Yeah. Leading by example won't work. Until, I'm going to give you the until, but generally saying, I do it better than you, do it the way I do it, isn't going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is in that very first point that I made, right? We have epistemic vigilance. And that epistemic vigilance means that we guard our worldview carefully against deception from others. But the underlying motivation for that is that we still have this strong desire to interact socially with others, to form relationships with other people, right? So we're simultaneously torn to protect ourselves from deception and influence of others, but to form relationships with them. What has happened is that scale has gotten tipped, right? And the vast majority of people who operate with high degrees of epistemic vigilance are doing so because they feel comforted on the social side by some tribalism, right? So they feel like if their allegiance is good, then they don't have to worry about getting cheated by the other side. They know who the cheaters are. They're the people dressed in blue or the people dressed in red, right? It's really easy. So that's a really compelling and simple story. And again, because we are the products of evolution, because of the principle of conservation, we want easy because we want to conserve our energy. What do you do then with people who are reasoning poorly, encountering poor information, and that you care enough about to change? You have to prove to them first that you care about them, right? You have to give up on the logic of the moment, the reasoning of the moment, the convincing them, the showing them that they're wrong, the leading them to a better path, and you have to engage them as a person and develop a relationship of trust with them such that their epistemic vigilance is not a barrier between you and them. And that starts with really simple stuff like active listening, asking them to explain more, and not listening with judgment, but listening to genuinely understand, because we are incredibly tuned in to know when people are judging us, right? That's a fundamental principle of social interaction. We don't want to be judged harshly by others. And so the moment that creeps in, and I can sense it, right? You don't have to see body language, you don't have to hear it in the tone of voice, you can just feel it, right? The moment that interaction, the moment that connection is not genuine, we reject it. And that's also why saying, do it my way, it's the right way, is not going to work, because they already don't trust you, right? So they're not going to follow you. You got to build a relationship first, which makes a lot of people go, I can't imagine talking to those people. Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem, right? Because we can't form relationships with them, we can't get beyond that epistemic vigilance, and we're never going to correct it. So you got to make yourself vulnerable. And that vulnerability begins with treating that other person as a person. That's tough because a lot of the views that they hold are distasteful. And I'm not saying the people that don't agree with me hold distasteful views. I mean, everybody who is is a product of this strong polarized political moment thinks that of others on the other side, that their views are distasteful. And that's tough to get to a point where you can treat someone whose views you see as distasteful as another human being. That's tough, but that's where it's got to start. Yeah?
I know you do work across a lot of disciplines. Do you find that there are current disciplines that are really encouraging reasoning and doing a good job of helping develop scholars in their reasoning? And then secondly, could you give us some practical strategies if you want to become better? And I know you talked about a few things like, looking at content that you normally wouldn't, being vulnerable, things like that. But could you give us some other strategies as well, practical strategies that aren't like hugely time consuming? You have to take classes in it and all that. To improve our reasoning. There are two different questions.
Yeah, two different questions. I'll try to answer them both briefly. Are there disciplines that are doing a really good job with helping us understand how we reason and how to reason more effectively? Yeah. Cognitive science and cognitive psychology, both of which have branches that study reason explicitly. There's some really cool stuff happening right now. That Nature article that I put up there is fascinating in that it actually provides physical, observable evidence of this notion of spatiality and reasoning. And we're finding all kinds of stuff like that that's going on right now. So that in and of itself is worth reading. That's where I'm getting a lot of these ideas from. That has shaped so much of how I teach people to argue and what I do to improve their ability to argue. It has been so influential to me. So I would strongly encourage you to look at both cognitive psychology and cognitive science and their studies of reasoning, how people reason and what works in those circumstances. Your second question is really easy to answer. How do we improve people's ability to reason? Where do we find the educational processes that will do that? The sub-question that you asked is, how can we do it quickly and effortlessly? Unfortunately, you can't, right? It is something that is an iterative process. You get better to reason, better at reasoning, the more you reason. So the simple answer to your question is, where can I learn to do this more effectively? Is going to sound really biased and self-serving. Join a debate team. I'm not joking about that. Find opportunities to argue with other people in venues that are safe and developmental. And a debate program is a great example of where that happens. It's safe because everybody knows you're not arguing from your convictions, so there's no chance of social rejection because of your views. You've been assigned a position. And it's iterative. You do it time and time and time and time again, and generally get good quality feedback. And even if you don't get good quality feedback, the practice itself is feedback. Practicing that reasoning is feedback. That's what develops that interlocutor. That's what makes you better able to reason, and that's what makes you a better functional citizen. I have kept you here much longer than you anticipated now. I'll say once again, thank you all very much for your attention, and thanks once again to all the groups that brought me here. I really enjoyed spending time with you.
I invite you to take pizza home.